So good morning, everyone. My name is Heather Bacher. I am the coordinator for an initiative here in Indiana called Women for the Land. We outreach and do outreach and education to women, Hoosier women landowners and operators to help them learn about conservation practices that they can implement on their farm ground, their gardens, their community spaces, that kind of work. So we are an initiative of several conservation groups in the state, both federal, state, and local agencies. And we normally meet in person and have lady-only meetings, but in this time of COVID, we've been doing more virtual programs, and we've had the pleasure to include some of the other sex, some gentlemen with us. So welcome to all of you fellas. We're happy to have you here. I'm going to go ahead and turn the presentation over to our guest speaker, Mitch Ziske. But before I'll do that, I'll just say everyone is muted. So if you would please stay muted for the time being, that would help keep everything quiet and running smoothly. We are recording this, so it will be available on YouTube, and I'll send a link out after that. And if you have questions as we go along, Mitch will pause at a few spots to take questions, and then we'll have a chance to talk at the end as well. So the easiest thing would be if you have questions to put them in the chat, directed to me or directed to everyone, so that I can sort of filter those for Mitch, because as he's talking, he'll have a little bit of trouble trying to keep up with chat. So again, welcome everyone, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Mitch.
Great, thanks Heather, and welcome everyone again. If you were here last week, it's good to see you again, and if you're new, it's nice to meet you, at least electronically. And so once again, I'm excited to be able to present some information about pond management. This is a program I've been working on for a few years now, and it's really great to start sharing some of the resources with you all, and to answer any questions you might have about today's topic or about any other topics related to pond management. So let me share my screen here and we'll get started. Okay, so this 4-part series is really focused on pond management. It's focused on managing the, whether you have a pond on your property, a rural pond, or whether you are part of a lake association or a homeowners association that has a pond that you're looking to manage. This is really targeted at those folks, and also if you're a conservation educator or something like that and looking to learn more about pond management, this is another great place to come. So last week we focused on the pond ecosystem and what that looks like, and today we're going to get more into some of the practical applications of that knowledge and things that we can do for pond management. So if you weren't here last week, this is just a slide that tells you a little bit about me. The 2 key things here is that if you're interested in our pond management resources, you can go to our website, which is ws.extension.purdue.edu/pondwildlife. The link is here. And if you want to get in contact with me directly, my email address is here. And so I'm more than happy to answer your questions via email and go from there. So, and you should be able to get this information from the recording. So this is what the 4-part series looks like. You've probably all seen the flyer. So like I said, last week we spoke about the pond ecosystem as a whole and the fact that it's really quite complex and there are lots of different things going on. And today we're going to take sort of the next step in, telling you a little bit about a pond management plan and pond monitoring, and what is a management plan, what does it look like, why should you do it, and how do you do it, and then some of the monitoring that we should do around our pond to help inform that management plan. Then the next 2 weeks, we'll dive into some specific management of various parts of the pond. So next week, we'll look at fish, and we'll cover stocking and harvest and some of the things you need to consider when you're managing fish. And then the last presentation will be on aquatic vegetation. What is it? Why is it good? Why is it bad? And how do we go about managing that? So please join us for those sessions as well. And so the goal for today is really to learn, understand what a pond management plan is, what it looks like, why you might do it, when you should do it, and to give you the tools that you need to actually develop a management plan for your pond. And really, what I want to sort of pass along too is how it can be really useful to improve your management and to really help you enjoy your pond more. There's not, no point in going through the process of developing a management plan if it doesn't really change things in your pond. So I want to talk a little bit about how it can really help your management and answer any questions you might have about, implementing a management plan for your pond. So I figure a good place to start is a pond management plan, and what is it, right? And so we, a pond management plan is basically a tool that we can use to help us manage our pond. And if you manage other things, if you manage crops on your property, or you manage woodlands on your property, or if you manage other things with your work, maybe you're you manage a team of people, you manage money, all of those sort of management actions, we typically have a plan associated with that. And so we're trying to take that planning approach to ponds as well. And it's really trying to start your pond management with thinking about what you want to get to, and then trying to build the blocks so that you can get to that. So a pond management plan is a written document. It can be as brief or as complicated as you'd like, but the more information you put in it, the more useful that might be for your management. And so it's really a written outline of what you want to get from your pond. Every pond's different, and every pond owner is different. Some people want to use their pond primarily for swimming. Some people want to develop a very natural environment where they can attract wildlife and birds and things like that. And some people really want to fish and be able to catch, lots of fish or big fish from their pond. And so all of those goals are different, and all of those goals require different management. And so a really important part of the management plan is actually getting you to write down and think about some of your goals. Some goals can be sort of conflicting with each other, and you might have to choose which one is more important to you. Or sometimes we can include a couple of sort of complementary goals together in our management. Another thing that the pond management plan is it helps record what has happened in the pond previously. So you might include some information about the history of the pond. If you built it, when did you build it? What changes has it undergone during that time? If you've bought a new pond or a new property, you might get some of this information from the past owner. And also, what management have you done of the pond in the past? Herbicide application, stocking fish, things like that. And then the bulk of a management plan is really a database for monitoring that you will do on your pond. And so when you're looking to monitor fish, monitor plants, monitor the pond construction, all of those things require data that you need to record so that you can track it through time. It's difficult to know whether your fish population is growing well or is in balance if you don't record some of these data and then look back to those data and compare it to where you are now. So I'm going to talk a lot about that today, about what sort of data do you need to collect, and how you do that, and how management plan can help you sort of organize and interpret those data. And then sort of the last part of a management plan is really looking ahead to the future. So you might have some information in there about what your current strategies are for management. So, you've collected some data and you've sort of got an idea of where you want to go, and you might put down some of your management plans. You might also make some notes on what's worked and what hasn't worked in the past. You might say, well, I've had this aquatic vegetation, this aquatic plant species coming back year after year. I've been doing this, but it hasn't really made much difference. And so that's important to put in there so that you need to change something in the future. And it's another good place to put any photos you take. We've all got cameras on our phones now. It's pretty easy to walk around and snap photos of things, what's happening through the season, or weird things or bizarre things that you find. And the management plan is a good place to store a lot of this and other observations you might have. The one thing I want to say here is that, the management plan, we're talking about this sort of written document. It could be supported by things that are not written, right? It could be videos, photos, things like that. But really, it's good to think about this plan as a living document. So this is not something you do once and then, store it away and never look at it again. This is something that you do. You might do every year, every couple of years, but you keep going back and checking, the data you collect against your goals and then make changes and then move on from there. And so this, it might be something that you need to save lots of different versions of so that you can track how your management has changed through time. So that's what a pond management plan is, but why do we need it? And, I think, I've mentioned this already, but it's always good to to have a strategic approach to what you're doing. Otherwise, you don't know what you do, you don't know whether what you do works, doesn't work, or whether you need to change things up or things like that. The first, reason to do a pond management plan links back to what we spoke about last week. Ponds are pretty complex systems. There's a lot going on. There's lots of non-living as well as lots of living factors, and then they all interact with each other. And so this pond management plan allows you to keep track of that a little bit. It allows you to break down each of these components and really identify, some of the things that you might need to do. For example, you might apply some aquatic herbicides to deal with a problem plant you have. But we now know from last week that these plants are important for fish communities. They provide habitat for invertebrates to live on that fish eat. And so you might put that herbicide in and you might actually be negatively impacting your fish population. And this pond management plan allows you to track that, identify that, and maybe change the things that you do in the future. A management plan is really just, it's a clear record of your goals, what you've done in the past and what you want to do in the future. And like I said, we can we think we remember what we've done, but often if you try and, guess what you did 5 years ago and then actually go back to a photo or something, it might be actually quite different. And so really the management plan is trying to overcome the shortcomings of the human memory, right? And so we want to provide a clear structure that we can record information in, go back and check next year or in a few years' time, see what's changed and see what we need to do to change our management to continue working towards our goal. Another thing that a pond management plan is really useful for is coordinating management. And so if you have a pond on your property that you just manage yourself, it might be quite simple to just keep a record of what you do and what you need to do in the future. But a lot of people also work with consultants or biologists to help them with pest control or with fish stocking. Or sometimes, like I mentioned, there might be multiple landowners trying to manage a single water body. And so these management plans can be a really great way to coordinate between these different groups. If you're working with a consultant, if you've already got a plan developed of what you want to get out of your pond and what you've done in past years, that's going to be a really great resource for that consultant or biologist to help you in the future. Likewise, if you're working with lots of people, it's likely that people are going to have different goals for that pond or lake. And so, working together to build this management plan might help you get to a common goal and start to identify the things that you need to do for that lake. And, one of the other things that I think is great about a pond management plan is it really promotes learning on, individual learning, group learning, and engagement with your pond. Some people might, want a pond. They might want to just, pay a consultant to do everything on that pond so that they get the results that they want. And that's fine. But a lot of people want to try and do things themselves, and creating a management plan and reading through the materials that we've developed for this can really help you learn about your pond. Getting out there and assessing things, a few times through the year, every year, can really allow you to learn more about your specific pond, about the fish there. It can help you engage with your pond. And then if you do decide to work with a consultant or a biologist, you have a pretty good understanding of what's there already, and you can assess, well, am I getting my money's worth out of what they're doing? Or if you're getting quotes, you might actually be able to assess the differences between those quotes and things like that. So, I'm in natural resources education, so I'm always a big, proponent of learning. And I think when you get into building your own management plan, I think that really helps you learn, more things about ponds and more things about pond management. So I guess one of the questions I get is when should I write this management plan? When is the best time to do that? And I always say, well, anytime. Start now if you haven't got one. Anytime's a great time to start on this. if you do have some ideas, maybe it's now's the time to start coordinating some of those photos and some of the measurements of fish you've taken or whatever into a sort of coordinated place. If you've already got a detailed management plan, then that's great. But maybe now you need to, it might be time to revise it for the first time or something like that. Management plans and this monitoring process I'm going to talk about today is particularly useful when you've bought a new property. So you might have a pond there that you've got no idea what's in it or what's happened. Like I said, try and get as much information as you can from the previous owner, because that'll help you decide what to do and what works best. But sometimes they might not know or whatever. And so, this can be a great time to start a plan and start assessing what's there. It gives you a great baseline understanding of what you've got, and then that can help you decide what you need to do to get to where you want to be. I've spoken to some pond consultants over the years, and they'll often go out and do assessments for people, and they even recommend, if you've got the time and the sort of capacity to do so, if you're thinking about buying a property and one of the main motivators of that is the pond that it has, it might be worthwhile doing an assessment before you buy it, so that you can validate what the landowner is saying. If they say, listen, this pond's full of 10-pound bass, and you are able to maybe work with a consultant to get that assessed before you buy it, and you find out there's a bunch of 8-inch bass in there that are stunted or something, then that may help you negotiate when you're buying a property. So if you can do something before you buy a property, that can also be really useful. Another great time to develop a plan is if you've had a pond on your property or for a long time, and it's sort of been neglected or it's been managed in a haphazard manner, or that can be a great time to decide that you want to put the effort into developing a plan, and then putting more structure around that management so that you can sort of renovate that pond back to what you'd like it to be. And then if you're dealing with reoccurring problems, it could be certain vegetation that's causing problems every year. It could be that you've got stunted fish in your pond, and no matter what you've done over the past 5 years or so, you haven't been able to fix that. That can be a great motivation to develop this plan, because it can help you record all the data you've got and can help you make clear decisions moving forward, and hopefully allow you to have better success with your pond management and with using your pond in the future. And so what we, people say, well, this plan, how often should I do it? Is this something that I need to be doing all the time? And really, it's up to the individual landowner and how much effort they want to put in. Typically, the more information that you collect, the better that you can make decisions. And so usually what we say is if you're going to do a comprehensive assessment of your pond, the fish that are there or anything like that, that might be something you do once a year or maybe once every other year. But if you want to just record other things like vegetation or whether you've got leaks in your dam, this might be something you can actually do a couple of times throughout the year. And some of these things, particularly vegetation, they change throughout the year, and so you might by only monitoring those things once a year, you might miss certain things. So if you can, monitoring can be as easy as walking around your pond with a rake or with a fishing rod and spending an afternoon, doing that. So it can be pretty simple, and you might want to do this a few times a year to get some really great information. And then with regards to sort of updating the plan, this living document that you might want to go back and revise and stuff like that, we recommend every couple of years is a good time for that. If you're really changing the sorts of management that you do, you might want to do it every year. So say you've got a pond with stunted fish. If you determine that because you did your first plan and your first assessment, and you might say, okay, I know the sort of the drastic actions I need to take to fix that. You might do those drastic actions in the fall or the spring, and then you might want to update your management plan in the very next year to see how things are going and do things like that. But if your pond's pretty balanced and you're pretty happy with it, you might only update it every 2-3 years or more if things are not changing very much. Okay, and so we, like I said, we've developed a lot of resources at Purdue now for pond management, and one of those is helping with the pond management plan. And so we'll have some links to these documents for you, and these can all be found on our website. But basically, there are 2 documents that I'm going to sort of work through today that talks about the pond management plan. One of those is called Managing Fish Populations, and this is something that focuses on fish because there's lots of different data that we need to collect for fish and strategies we can use for managing fish. I'm going to talk more about this next week when I get into fish management, but that's a publication that you can use to sort of get an idea of this management process. But the main document I'm going to focus on today is this document called a template for your management plan. And this is actually a PDF that you can download. And, you know, apart from this front page, which has text on it, the rest of it is basically a bunch of boxes where you can enter information and answer questions about your pond. You can then save it, and then that's essentially your management plan done. And you can go back in a year or a few years and update that accordingly. So we've developed this great template that can help you sort of collect the information and the data that you need to sort of fill out your pond management plan. Associated with this document on our website is a bunch of Excel spreadsheets that you can download. And so maybe as you're going through collecting data on fish or plants, rather than, you know, entering it into this PDF, you'd prefer to have it in an Excel format that you can work on, then you can also do that as well. Okay, I might just stop there for a minute. I'm going to step through the different parts of the management plan and some of the things that you might look to collect and consider for a management plan. But I'll stop here for the moment and see if there are any questions that you might have so far. Okay, I can't see any questions in the chat right now, so that's fine. It's been pretty introductory info at the moment, so I'll just keep moving forward, and then hopefully we'll have some more questions here as we cover some of this other content. Somebody was asking about where to download the template. So if you go to our website, I guess what I can do is just show you right now. Seeing as this, let me stop sharing this for a moment, and now see if I can share my internet browser. Oh, there is a link in the chat. Great, thanks Jessica for sending that through. But I will just share this now anyway. So this is what our pond management and our wildlife management page looks like. And so this is the home page. It's extension.purdue.edu/pondwildlife, and you'll have a link to that. And then basically what you do is you can either go to pond management or wildlife management. And if you go to pond management, it basically takes you to 4 topic pages that we have. And if you go to fish population management, you click that one. That's where you can get a link to download these documents. So we have our this is our managing populations document. This is a template here. And so if you click on this picture, it should take you to a place where you can download the template, but you can also, on this section down here, you can download the actual Excel data sheets. And these just link to the Purdue education store. And so if you forget this stuff or you misplace the link, if you go to the education store and you put in like fish management or pond management, then these will all pop up for you to download anyway. Okay. So there are 4 main parts to a pond management plan. The first of that is providing some history about the pond so far. So some information there about the location of the property, the size of the pond, you know, how old the pond is, how deep it is, when you purchased the pond or built the pond, and if you've worked with any consultants in the past and stuff like that. So that's just some background information. And this is something you probably won't have to update very much, but it's just a great place to put all that information in the first place. The second part of the plan is to think about the goals and objectives you want to get out of the pond. And so we talk a little bit about this in those documents, and in the template, it provides some questions about what you might want to use the pond for. And it's important to have these goals and objectives in there because this really drives the sort of management you're going to do. If you want to use your pond predominantly for swimming, you're going to have different aquatic management strategies than if you want to use it for attracting wildlife or for fishing. And so it's really important to get these goals down. And you can go back through the years and or go back over the years and change these if your goals and objectives change. But it's really great to have these spelled out pretty clearly in the first place, because that helps drive what you do. And I always like to tell people your goals for your pond are your goals. They're not your neighbor's goals. They're not what your friend did down the road. They're not what people tell you should do. The reason you have a pond and the reason that you've bought a property with a pond, or you've put the money into building a pond, is because you want to get something out of it and you want to use it for something. And don't be honest with yourself about this. It's just because the person down the road builds a pond that attracts all the great wildlife and everything, and they say that you should do the same thing, but you want to have a swimming pond, then that's fine, right? That's your goals and objectives. And so yeah, I always like to say that, because sometimes you talk to your neighbors, you talk to your friends, and they tell you about what they've done with their management, and that's great, but that might not be suitable for what your objectives are. The third part of the pond management plan is really the meat and potatoes of it, and that's where you want to assess the current status of your pond. So this is particularly important if your pond hasn't been assessed in a while. You want to assess the water clarity, the depth, the vegetation, the type of the vegetation you have there, your fish populations. And as you go around and collect all these data, you can start making decisions about, well, do I have a stunted fish population, or are my fish actually in good condition? Is there any problems with my water clarity that I might need to consider? So step 3 is really important, because it's really providing you with the information that you need to determine the sort of management that you need to put forward in the future. And the last part of the plan is really what you're going to do with the information you have. So it's looking at your assessment data, your monitoring data, and saying, okay, well, what do I need to do to get towards my goals? What are my future goals for the property? What are the strategies I want to do this year, next year, and the next 5 years? And what do I need to do to work towards those goals? And so that, these are the things that will probably change every time you do a management plan, because you might say, well, I used herbicide X, but that didn't really solve my problem. So this time around, I'm going to try something different. Yeah, and so I'm just going to step through some of these different parts of the plan. Some of these things I'm going to not go into too much detail on, particularly the fish and the vegetation, because they're going to be the topics of upcoming seminars. But it'll just give you an idea of what the sorts of information we collect, how we do it, and how that template can help you sort of record some of this information. Okay, so the first part of the template is providing property information and history. So Heather, did we have a question or anything, or are we good to keep going?
We're good to keep going. I'm sorry. Yes.
Great.
No questions right now.
No problem. So this is basically the first few pages of that template. And so, like I said, there's that asks you information about your property, the owners, the address, the county, and it asks you a little bit about the history there. What's been done to this pond in the past. This is anything from construction to whether you've had it dredged out. If part of that history here is you need to have it dredged out of sediment every 5 years, then that's going to influence the way that you manage your pond as well. So, you, like I said, on the PDF template, you can type directly in these boxes and save your information. And then it also asks you to, include other information. Do you have maps of your pond that you can incorporate? So, you might use Google Earth. You might use some of the soils maps that you can get access to. You might have a topographical map that helps show how water might flow into your pond. And so you can access all of these maps. You might take screenshots of them, copy links of them, and you can either paste the links in here, or you might decide to save those as a folder in your pond management folder in your computer or something like that. If you really want to have like printed materials, then you can print this stuff out, and then you can also print the maps out and just sort of insert them into the management plan at this point as well. Like I said, these are the things that aren't probably going to change from year to year too much, but they're great. It's great to to go to the effort to find some of this information, then keep it somewhere that you can refer back to it. It also asks for the pond size and then the watershed size. So the pond size, you can calculate this. The best way to calculate pond size is to go to Google Earth and to just measure the area around your pond. You might want to validate that by sort of walking the pond or something like that, but usually that gets it pretty close. You might also do the same thing for your watershed. If you know the general topography of the area and you want to sort of draw an area around that on Google Maps, that'll give you an idea of what size the watershed is and what parts of the watershed are being used for different things. You know, you might have 90% forest in your watershed, or you might have 90% ag fields, and so you might need to consider that with your management. And then the last sort of column here on its page 3 of the plan is your objectives. And so it asks you, you know, what do you want to do with the pond primarily? Do you have other things you'd like to do there as well? You know, if you want to primarily use the pond for fishing, you might also want to use it for swimming. And so that you might manage your vegetation slightly differently than if you were just worried about fishing and that's it. And a lot of this guide is focused on fish because that's sort of, that can be a lot of the, you know, a lot of the decisions you make and a lot of the control you have over your pond relates to the fish in that pond. And so a couple of these also relate to some specific questions about fishing. You know, if you want to have a fishing pond, do you want to have just general all-around fishing where you can catch some fish to eat for sport, things like that? Or do you want to have a very specific type of fishing pond? Do you want to be able to catch trophy bass out of your pond? Or do you want to have lots of fish you can harvest out to eat? So those fishing objectives will change the specific management we do with fish. And like I said, I'll talk more about that in our next seminar. And so that sort of just is some general information about your pond. And once again, this is something that might not change too much from year to year, with the exception of maybe some of that management, some of those goals and objectives you have. The next part of the guide that, or you know, that we're going to focus a fair bit on is monitoring and assessment. And so this is basically where, you know, if you're doing this pond management, if you're doing this management plan for the first time, this could be really important in getting a great understanding of what your pond is like at the moment. And this is something where you might want to update this information every year. It might take you 2 or 3 times during the year to get information to put in this guide. You know, like I said, with the aquatic vegetation, things grow and die, you know, at different times during the year. And so you might want to go out in the spring, the summer, and the fall, and that might give you the information you need to sort of complete the vegetation section of your plan. And so the first part of this is the physical characteristics of a pond or dam. And this is definitely not my area of expertise. And if you have very specific questions about this, whether it's construction or whether it's maintaining your pond slope or your pond shore or the dam that you have, I definitely recommend reaching out to your NRCS or Soil Water Conservation District. The local officers there, they'll have some great resources for you. But we have both of these resources on our website, so you can click and download these and get more information about the physical characteristics of a pond. So the first one here is a PDF that talks about planning, design, and construction of your pond. So this is obviously a great resource if you're looking to build a new pond, but it also provides lots of information about the considerations and characteristics of a pond that even if you have a pond that's already built, this may give you some information about the things you need to look out for with your pond. But the one resource that I think is really great and ties back into this monitoring and assessment is that they have this pond inspection checklist. And so this is, once again, something you can click and download from our website. And basically it has a whole bunch of different characteristics that you can go through and check around your pond every year, every other year, whatever schedule you want to do this on. And, you know, it covers things like the slope of your pond, whether that is being maintained well, what sort of vegetation is growing on there. It focuses a lot on the dam and about inspecting parts of your dam, inspecting the spillway, inspecting the emergency overflow, checking whether or not you have trees growing on your dam. You know, like typically we don't want trees growing on a dam because those roots can cause leaks in the dam. But if you already have trees on there that are a certain size, you don't want to kill those off because as they die, their roots, as they break down, will leave large cavities in your dam. So there's lots of things to consider when thinking about the physical characteristics of a pond and dam. Like I said, this isn't my area of expertise, but with these 2 documents, you can get a great understanding of what some of the important considerations are, and the sorts of things you can do every year to make sure that these things are in tip-top condition. It's a great opportunity in the winter when the plants are all, there's no leaves on the trees, there's not much else to do. You can get out there and walk the perimeter of your pond. You can walk the dam and inspect for leaks and for stuff like that. And you might be able to do some things where you patch up those leaks or add bentonite to sort of prevent that leaking before we start to get that spring snow melt in those spring rains. And so this is definitely something that I encourage you all to do every year is focus in on some of these physical characteristics and to make sure everything's in tip-top shape, and before you start thinking too much about fish or vegetation or things like that. Okay, I see there's I'm just going to stop here if anybody has any other questions, but I do see there's a question from Peg about how do we, what type of consultant should we use to help us? And that's really a great question. There are lots of different consultants out there. There are some really big companies that do it all, right? They grow their own fish, they'll stock your ponds, they'll come out and apply herbicides a little bit like your lawn guy might do. They'll do assessments. They'll bring a boat out and shock fish in your pond and basically do a really great assessment of the fish. And so there are companies that do it all. There are people that just focus on aquatic vegetation management and anywhere in between, really. And so we have a link on our website to educators and biologists that you can reach out to if you're looking for general information. But we don't have a link at the moment to like all available consultants in your area. We want to construct something like that for sure. But we just encourage you to, it's like if you were getting something, some renovations done on your house or anything like that. We encourage people to talk to a few operators, if you have access to a few of them in your area, and get quotes from a couple people for different things, and really, sit down and ask questions about what they're going to do and things like that. And honestly, a really good consultant should be asking you questions a little bit like some of the topics I'm bringing up here today. They should be asking about what your goals are for your pond, what you want to get out of your pond, what things you really value. Do you want to, minimize chemical use? Do you want to, do something else? Do you want to have certain fish species there? Because, like I said, ponds are all different, and ponds really need to be suited for what you want. And if a consultant plans to just come in and use like a run-of-the-mill approach that they use on it for everyone, then that's not going to have the best results. And so I'd definitely look out for them asking questions like that. And also, just like you would with the other things, ask them for references. And if you can get some references and go and speak to people that have used them in the past, I think that's great. And you might even, if you know someone locally that's used them in the past, you might be able to go out and see their pond and see the sort of results that they've had. So that would be my best advice, is to really just vet them and I'm sure it's just like with anything else. You probably, there's probably really inexpensive people, there's probably really expensive people, and everybody in between. So you probably want to look out for the people that are super inexpensive, and then you might want to just try and choose someone in the middle that provides a good service at good value. But yeah, they're just some things to think about, and I think something we want to do in the future is develop like a list of questions that you can maybe ask consultants when you meet with them, right? Like if we have a document that's got 10 or 12 questions, that would be good for you to ask them, how long they've been operating, how many ponds do they do, that sort of thing. I think that could be a great resource for everyone as well. But that's just some general advice there to start with. The other thing you could do too is, because there are a lot of local resources out there for you with extension educators or at the NRCS office or things like that. I think if you do get some information and some quotes from people and a bit of a description of what they plan to do, you might be able to double check that with some local, educators that don't do the work, but they might be able to say, well, this sounds okay to me, or something like that. And also, if you ever want to email me with some questions or concerns or anything like that, I'm more than happy to check them out as well. Great, thanks, Peg. Good question. Okay, so that sort of covers I'm not going to dive into the physical stuff too much about a pond or a dam, because like I said, we have these resources there. We have a podcast episode where we had someone on from the NRCS who talks about a lot of these things too. So if you're interested in some of these things, then I definitely recommend checking out that podcast episode. So vegetation is sort of the next thing that I want to just mention, and then there's an important part of the management plan, and there's an important part of monitoring. I've mentioned this a few times, but vegetation changes throughout the year, so this might be something you want to do multiple times throughout the year to get a good idea on what you have. There's a document that we have through Purdue that talks a lot about managing and identifying aquatic plants. We're in the process of updating this. This was actually done by a professor here at Purdue who's now retired, but this was done, I think, about 10 or 12 years ago. And so we have a draft at the moment where we've updated this and included some new tools and chemicals and stuff like that. And so that should be coming out by the end of the year. But if you want to, jump into it, this is still a great publication that'll give you lots of information about plants. And then the part of our template that covers plants looks like this. And so this is basically splits the plants up into different categories, whether they're emergent, so things growing along the shoreline, whether they're floating, whether they're submergent, or whether it's algae or something like that. And you can go out, you might say, okay, in May, we'll go out and we'll basically assess all the plants that we have in our pond and what they are and how much of our pond that they're covering. And so some of these densities are percentages. Some of them we ask you to just choose 1 to 5 or 1 to 4, depending on what you see. And then some of them talks about the pond volume. Do you have filamentous algae covering your whole pond, or is it like 10% of the volume or something like that? The good thing about not only recording what's there, but how much is there, is that when you do things like apply herbicides, you can then, you might go through this assessment in May, plan to do some herbicide applications in June, July, and then you might go back and do an assessment in August, and you might see how some of these things have changed. And so most of these, we just do a visual inspection. So you just look out and see, okay, well, the cattails cover 25% of the perimeter. We have duckweed floating on, 40% of the pond, stuff like that. You might need to get in and scoop some stuff up to be able to identify things. And that's where you can use this other document here to help you identify what plants you have. The only sort of exception, I guess, to this visual survey is with the submersed plants. So a lot of the submersed plants you can't see. And so we need to do something else to try and see what's there and how much is there. And the best way to do this is what we call a rake toss. So this is something where you can go and get yourself a garden rake, tie a rope to the handle, throw it out in the water, and then you pull it back in. And that sort of collects a bunch of that submerged vegetation on the forks of that rake. You can, if you wanted to, you can go out and cut the handles off the rake, put 2 rakes back to back, and then throw it out like that. That's what we use when we do our assessment, but really you can just use a standard rake you have. And the purpose of doing that is every time you throw it out, it's pretty standardized. So you can, go out and do 4, 6, 8 rake tosses around your pond, and you should be able to get a good idea of how much of those plants are there. And then we have some photos in our template that talk about, how to quantify what you have. So basically a 4 would be the rake is just completely clogged with vegetation. A 1 is where there's just a few pieces hanging off the rake, and then 2 and 3 are in between that. And so this is, once again, just keeping a record of how much you have, what you have, so that you can monitor it from year to year, but also so that you can see changes as you do management. And if you're not seeing changes as you do management, you might need to then change the management that you're doing. I will say that for plants, this is a really great opportunity to take photos and video as well, because, a photo can is worth 1,000 words, they say. And if you take some photos of the plants you find, or the duckweed on the surface of your pond, that can really be a great indicator of of what it looks like now and how it might change with management. But we're going to get into plants in a lot more detail in session 4 of this series. There's a question of, yeah.
I'm sorry, I have a quick question from Sarah. She's asking, are there certain times of the year we should avoid a rake toss so as not to damage, so as not to disturb nesting fish?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I would say that if you can visually see bass or bluegill nesting around the perimeter of your pond, then it's probably not the best time to do a rake toss. I would say that, and that usually happens May, June in Indiana, into July for the sunfish. And so, you usually can see them. They usually nest, in less than 4 feet of water. And so you can usually see them. And so you can either avoid doing the rake tosses then, or if you don't have that many nesting, you might be able to pick and choose areas between the nests to do it. You can also do these things from a canoe or a small boat. So if you want to go out and get an idea of what's on the bottom of your pond in the middle, you can go out, throw the rake out in a boat and then pull it back in that way too. But typically, I recommend doing this pretty early in the spring, obviously not too early because you're probably not going to have many plants there early, but you might be able to do this, at some point in May. And then, you might want to do it in the heat of the summer and then once again in the fall to get an idea of what's there. It'll also tell you, the rake toss can be really useful because it can not only show you the living plants you have, but it can show you the dead and dying plants there because, they can add a lot to the nutrients in your pond. And also we spoke about last week that when things die, bacteria break them down and they start to use oxygen. And so if you do one of these rake tosses and you don't find many living plants, but you've got like giant clumps of dead plants, then that's something to consider. And you might say, that might lead you to install an aerator to help deal with some of that low dissolved oxygen issues or something like that. So it might also tell you whether you've got a lot of leaf litter in the pond. So there are lots of things that a rake toss can tell you. And so it's worthwhile doing them, early in the spring, late in the fall, and then in the heat of summer. And if you do that, you should avoid most of those sort of fish nesting times.
Thank you.
Okay. And yeah, like I said, we're gonna jump more into aquatic vegetation later in this series. And so I want to move on now to fish populations, and a lot of our template that we've developed and a lot of that other guide really focuses on fish, managing fish populations. And the reason for this is a lot of people are interested in fish, catching fish, eating fish, but they're also one of the things that we can have a lot of control over in our pond. Typically, we put fish in there. If you leave a pond sit and don't do anything with it, then, I think fish usually are pretty good at getting into places, but it's definitely not, you're not going to have desirable fish in there. So if you want to have a fishery in your pond, you go out, you stock fish, and then you have a lot of control over what you end up with, whether you want a lot of smaller fish, whether you want a few larger fish. And so there are lots of things you can do. Typically with plants, we either want them or we don't. And it's like, well, how do we get rid of the ones we don't want? And how do we keep the ones we want? But with fish, there's a lot more you can do. And so a lot of this plan focuses on collecting the data that we need to make some decisions about fish. Okay, so when we're considering fish, like I was saying when I got cut off, you really want to figure out what fish you have and whether they're good fish or bad fish. And I spoiler alert, if you've got bad fish in your pond, it can be really tricky to get rid of them. But that's something we'll talk more about next week. But a lot of the data we collect for fish is it data about the population. And so, if we have a population of bluegill in our pond, what does that population look like? Do we have lots of small fish and no big fish? And if that's the case, how do we fix that? Are they in balance with some other fish in our lake? Do we have a good balance between bluegill and bass? Or do we have one population sort of overtaking the whole pond? And then, if we do have fish in there, are they growing at a good rate and are they healthy? So, we can collect data on their length and their weight to get an idea of, well, are our fish about what they should be, or are they too skinny? Are they fatter than normal, which would be great? And then if they are those things, we can make management decisions about that. And then it's also a good idea, I mentioned this last week, but to keep an eye out for fish kills and understand what might be causing those fish kills so that you can obviously avoid those as much as possible. So when we're assessing fish, there are lots of different ways that we can do that. Like I said, one of the most, I guess, comprehensive ways you can do that is to hire a consultant or to work with a biologist that has an electrofishing boat. They can take that out on your pond, zap the fish temporarily, so don't worry about that too much. But that can get a really good, you can get a really good idea of all the fish that are there, anything from the small ones to the big ones and everything in between. So that's a really great way to get a comprehensive idea of what fish you have. But that can be a bit expensive, and you might not want to sort of pay a consultant to do that. And that's fine. There are other things that you can do yourself to get a really good idea of what fish you have. You know, it can be as simple as going out fishing and recording what you catch. You know, if you fish your pond a lot, you know, it might be great to go out and catch 20 bass and go home and think that's great. But if you actually record the length of those bass and you do that every time you go out, you can start to get a really good database on what your bass population looks like. You can do other things. You know, I always say that when you're assessing the fish populations, we don't only want to know what big fish we have, but we want to know what little fish we have too. And sometimes it's more difficult to capture the small fish. You can do things like use a bait net or a cast net, like we see Emily doing down here. That can be a great way to catch some of the smaller fish in your pond. Something that I've had really good success with is putting minnow traps out in your pond, put a bit of dog kibble in there, and that can be a great way to assess what small bluegill you have in your pond, because they go in those traps and you can just lift them up and measure them. You can walk around your pond. So we were talking a little bit ago about nesting fish. And so in the spring and the summer, the bass and the bluegill will create nests that you can go and count and see. And if you walk around your pond in those times of the year and you're not seeing those nests, chances are you don't have a really good spawning population of those fish. And so that's another thing that you can record and keep track of through time. And so, you know, we outline more of these details in our guide, and we can talk more about these next week. But really, you know, the key with assessing your fish is that you want to get a good idea of the different species and the different sizes you have. So if you go out and you fish with a topwater frog at sunset, you're going to catch bass, and that's probably all you're going to catch, and larger bass. So it might, if you're really interested in getting an idea of what fish you have, you might go out bobber fishing with a worm. Sometimes you might change the time you fish or the areas you fish in your pond. You might, you know, put a minnow trap out or get a cast net or a drag net that you can assess some of these smaller individuals, because they can really tell us what's happening in our pond. Another thing to look for is, you know, do our fish have any diseases or parasites and stuff like that? In a lot of cases, you know, diseases, parasites, you know, fungus, they're all a pretty natural part of the system. And so typically they're not going to like decimate the fish in your pond. But it's definitely something to keep an eye on. And if you're seeing things pop up more and more, then that might be an opportunity to reach out to a consultant or a local biologist or something to ask them, you know, what's going on here, and is this something that we can control? But for the most part, you know, fish kills occur because of low dissolved oxygen or incorrect use of chemicals, more so than it does like a disease outbreak or anything like that. So before we get onto the goals section, I just want to switch over now to show you the actual template so that you can get an idea of the sorts of information you can collect on fish. So, okay, so this is that template document I've been talking about. So you can download this, and as you scroll down, you can see there are different sections here you can enter information into. And then, you know, once you type in here, you can just save it, and you can have it, you can change it, you can update it. We talk here about the different types of fishing you might want, whether you want a pond that's, you know, low maintenance, like something that just has catfish in it, and you just want to put catfish in, you feed them pelleted food, you catch them, you eat them. You know, that's a really low maintenance pond because you don't have to worry about different fish eating each other. And then we also talk about, whether you want general or purpose fishing or whether you want different types of trophy fishing. And that tells you a little bit about what those ponds might look like. That's the aquatic plants section. And so here we have basically the type of data that you'll be recording for fish. And so you basically just record the date that you went out and did something. It might be fishing, it might be throwing a cast net. Tells you, to record how long you did this for, because obviously if you fish for 30 minutes, you're probably going to catch less fish than if you fish all day. And then it just asks you to record the number of each species you caught and then whether or not you kept any of those to eat. Because this harvest section is actually really important for managing fish. And we'll talk a lot more about harvest next week. But harvest is basically the way that you can change your fish populations, because when you take fish out, you provide more room for the other fish to grow larger, and you also influence, how fish interact with each other and stuff. So harvest is a really important tool, and it's really good to record how many fish you catch and keep for eating, or whether you just need to harvest them because there are too many in the pond. And then once you're collecting the fish, we also want to get an idea of what size they are. So if you go out fishing in an afternoon, you might catch, 5 bass, and just record the size of those 5 bass, because that can be really useful to help us determine whether or not your fish are healthy, whether they're growing at a good rate, or whether they are in balance with the other fish that are in your pond. Likewise, if you have the capacity to do so, it's great to be able to record the weight of individual fish. If you have their length and their weight, we can start to get an idea of whether they're growing as they should be, whether they're smaller for their size, or whether they're heavier for their size than what's normal. So they're the types of data you would collect on your fish. And like I said, we have these spreadsheets to help you with that. We also have, I'll just quickly share this screen with you, if I can. So I mentioned that we also have an Excel file, and this is where if you want to record the data directly in here and actually do some data things yourself, we have this. This is a downloadable file that's associated with the template. And if you have any problems finding that, reach out to me. But basically, these are just the same as what I've showed you in the PDF. But if you prefer to work in Excel so that you can enter more data in, or you can add more rows or anything like that, you can do that here. So this is basically for the vegetation. This is for your fish, how much effort you put in and what you caught. This is for the fish length, and this is for the fish weight. And it's basically the same thing that we have in the PDF, but it allows you to add more data than, we didn't want to make a PDF that's like 200 pages long. So this is something you might keep, and you might save different files of this every time you go out and do your sampling, or every year or something like that. And then the last thing I want to point out regarding fish in this template is that the sort of third step of the plan here, it says, is to actually use those fish data for something. And so this is basically a page that asks you to summarize your data by different things. So here, this is by species, how many fish, how many bluegill did you catch, and how many did you harvest? And of those that you caught, how many were greater than 3 inches and how many were greater than 6 inches? The reason we ask for these sizes and the numbers for each of these sizes, it helps us determine where, what the sort of general structure of that population is like. And I'll talk more about this next week, but it's basically called proportional size distribution, and allows you to say, well, is most of my population small? Is most of them large, or is there a good variety in that population? And then the other thing we've got in this guide is basically a relative weight of the 4 common pond species. And so this allows you to say, okay, well, if I catch a bass that is 17 inches long, on average, it should be 2.7 pounds. And so if you say you catch 3 bass about this length in your pond, and they're all above this, then you know that you've got really good growth in your pond, and you've got nothing to worry about. But if you catch a bunch of 17, 18-inch bass and they're less than 2 pounds, then you know that your fish are much lighter than normal, and that you may have a problem with food, or you may have some other problems you need to look at. And once again, this gives you a space to record that information here, as well as a table to reference when you're making some of these decisions. Okay, and so, I jumped over this stuff pretty quickly because next week we're going to focus on looking at fish stocking, fish harvest, and some of the different things that we do. And so the last thing I want to talk about today as part of this plan is the future goals section. But before I do that, are there any questions right now about the aquatic vegetation or the fish management that we just spoke about?
Tim is asking if we'd share the URL for logging the download Excel sheet. So Mitch, is that part of that's part of the PDF that we'll share? That's the whole management plan, right? Those specific pieces?
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. So basically, sorry, I'm trying to manage all my screens here. So if you go to this link that I've just put in the chat now, that takes you to the Purdue Education Store page to download the PDF. But and let me just share it with you so I can, because it's a little tricky. We don't actually have a separate link for the Excel file. So I'll just show you how to get to that. And so basically that link I just copied in will take you here. If you want to download the PDF, you just click free download. If you want to download the Excel file, you click down here and you click on the click here for the pond management data sheets. And when you do this, it just automatically downloads them to your computer. So there's not an actual specific link for these that I can send you, but it's just found on that same page.
Great, thank you. We'll include that also in the follow-up email, those links. Are there other questions while we're at this pause? It doesn't appear so, Mitch.
Okay.
If you want to continue.
Great, yeah. So what I'll do is I'll just finish up now by talking about the future goals section of the plan. And so this is the sort of part of the management plan that might change a lot from year to year or however long you update this. And so this is basically asking you to look back to what your goals were. If it said, well, I want to fish, or I want to swim, or if I do want to fish, I want trophy bass or something like that. And then compare that to what you found with your assessment. So if you want trophy bass, but you found that all of your bass are 12 to 14 inches and they're all underweight, then you know that you don't currently have a trophy bass fishery. And so this is an area where you can record some of that information. Like, are your species in balance? Do you have the fish species you want there? And also ask some other questions that are not collected anywhere else. Like, have you put artificial habitat in your pond? And if so, what have you put in there? Have you used herbicides this year? Have you done any supplemental feeding? Do you have any unwanted fish species? And if so, what were they and how many did you find? Things like that. So this is basically a catch-all section at the end where you can record some other information about your pond and what you might want to do this year or next year with regards to management. And so, just to give you an idea of what this process may look like, if you've never done written a pond management plan before, what you might do is over the winter, you might start to fill out some of the first sections of this, about the pond history, about your goals. You then might want to get out in the spring, look at the vegetation, start looking at fish assessment. Throughout the year, you might collect fish data, collect vegetation data, and you can still continue to do past management that you usually do. If you usually apply certain herbicides every year, then definitely go ahead and keep doing that. But after that first year, you should have a pretty good idea of what fish you have, what the fish populations look like, what potential problems you have with vegetation. And then at the end of that first year is where you can start recording some of this information here and developing a strategy for your next year. And so you might not necessarily change anything or do anything new in the first year. It might really just be focused on recording the information that you need. And then that the following winter, you look back through your plan, you see, where you're meeting your goals, where you're not meeting your goals. You might reach out to some of your local educators about ideas for how to assess some of your problems or address some of your problems, and then develop a plan for what you'll do that next year. And so that's sort of what the general process might look like. And then at the end of that next year, you might do another assessment to see, well, how did that change things, and then go on from there. So like I said, it's very much a living document, or it's a document that you might save versions of every year or every other year. You can put as much or as little effort into this as you want, but the more effort you put into this, the better data you will have to make decisions, and hopefully the better outcomes you can have with your pond. So so that, that's really about it for this presentation. I'm happy to answer any and all questions you have. Maybe now that you've got links to these resources, maybe you could start reading through this and maybe filling in some information before our meeting next week. And you might wish to work through some of these things for the remainder of this year. So once again, I'm more than happy to answer emails. And so if you work through this, you have questions about how to collect fish or what to do if you're in this scenario, please send me an email or reach out to your local educators as well. So
thank you, Mitch.
Yeah, I think that's it.
Yes, we do have some questions. Once again, fascinating and great information. I know everybody's going to be very appreciative of all the templates and the plan. It just leads you right through it. So thank you so much. So Peg again is asking, she says, regarding their suburban retention pond, they do have some fish, but her question is, do you have any suggestions recommending specific fish just to help keep the pond healthy, clean, and good for wildlife in general?
Yeah, that's a good question. So for people who want to fish and they have a general Indiana pond, we recommend bass, bluegill, and catfish is basically a really good Midwestern mix of fish. Because the catfish are great to eat some of the dead and dying organisms off the bottom. They're fun to catch, good to eat occasionally if you catch them, and they don't really influence too much. So channel catfish is the preferred species. You don't want to get any of those really big catfish that you might get in the rivers. You don't want bullheads, which is a type of catfish, because they don't get very big and they basically just stir up the bottom and make your pond muddy. So if you are going to stock fish in there, then you want to get channel catfish. And then bass and bluegill, or bass, bluegill, and red ear. Bluegill and red ear are two different types of sunfish. They create a really good sort of ecosystem of predators and prey. So the bluegill will eat your insects and stuff, and they're fun to catch for kids. They're great to eat, but then they provide the main food for bass. You typically don't need to worry too much about adding minnows or adding pelleted food or anything like that. You can actually get bass and bluegill in balanced populations where you get good sized bluegill, good sized bass, and they can sort of help self-sustain each other. So that's what we typically recommend. If you're looking for species for say helping control plants, you might look into putting triploid grass carp in there. So these you've probably heard of these before. These are fish that will eat predominantly submerged vegetation like pondweeds. They typically don't like to eat algae too much, but it's typically like pondweeds or coontail, stuff like that, milfoil. And so you definitely need to check that you can put those in your water body. And if it's a public system, you might need to reach out to the DNR to get information about that. And you also need to buy those from a licensed hatchery so that you can be sure that they're triploid, which means they can't reproduce if they escape. And then we have, I'll talk about this next week, but we recommend stocking, I think it's like 5 to 10 individuals per acre. And the thing about grass carp is they get really big and live for a long time, but the older they get, the less effective they are at eating the plants. So their growth tends to stop and they don't need to eat as much. And so they tend to be most effective for like 5 to 7 years after you've put them in. And then so if you have some in your pond that that have been in there 20 years, you actually might need to get rid of them and put some new ones in for them to be more effective. But they don't reproduce or anything like that, but they just go around and eat plants. And then the other thing that I can talk more about next week is using tilapia. So you've probably all seen tilapia in grocery stores or in a restaurant. You can put those in your pond to eat algae. They're pretty good at eating algae. And the catch with them is that they don't survive through the winter. So you can put them in the spring, they can help eat your algae. And then in the fall, you need to try and get them out of there before they die. which is good. They're good to eat, but if you've got a really large pond, that might be pretty tricky. So, but we can talk more about those next week.
Jessica, who is with DNR, and urban wildlife biologist DNR, and a resource for us, did mention the grass carp. And she said that a lot of people have been sold that grass carp are the only ways to keep a pond clean. You mentioned the tilapia. Are there other species that you would think about in that regard?
Yeah, so they're really the two that we most recommend for like biological control of plants. And the tilapia are definitely newer than the grass carp. They've been around a while. It really just depends on what people mean by keeping their pond clean. You know, both of those species will eat vegetation, but if you have a muddy pond, they're not going to really help you fix a muddy pond. You know, there are other things that you can do to help muddy ponds, and also these biological controls for vegetation are not a silver bullet either, and you might need to use them in conjunction with other methods. And so, you know, we'll talk more about this when we talk about aquatic vegetation. But if you have nutrients coming in that are causing algae to grow, if you have sediment coming in making your pond murky, one of the best ways to deal with that is to provide some sort of buffer strip around the pond that helps catch a lot of those things before they get into the pond. But yeah, but those fish will help with vegetation, but they're not really going to clean up dirty ponds. They're not really going to clean up, you know, leaf litter on the bottom or anything like that.
Great, thank you. Julie asks, are crappie fish invasive, or are there invasive fish like carp?
Yeah.
Julie, I don't know if you're asking if there are other invasive fish. You understand that question, Mitch?
Yeah, I'll be able to answer that. So I get a lot of questions about other fish to put in ponds. You know, a lot of people who have been fishing might, you know, they want to catch crappie, whether it's black or white crappie. They might want to catch yellow perch, walleye, striped bass. And all of that, if you look at a fish hatchery to stock your ponds, a lot of those hatcheries will sell those fish to put in your pond. And I always tell people if they're looking to get a more diverse fishery like that, or they're looking to move away from the general recommendations of bass and bluegill, then they need to have some additional considerations and put in some more active management on their ponds. So one thing with crappie, you know, that crappie, you find crappie in a lot of ponds. Crappie are interesting because they grow larger than bluegill, and so sometimes they get too large for bass to eat. And they also have a pretty big mouth themselves. And so what happens is they can actually outcompete bass in your pond, and they can also cause issues with some of the bluegill population. And so we really only recommend putting crappie in ponds that are greater than about 5 acres in size, so that there's enough space for fish like that. And the same sort of recommendation goes for some of these other species. However, there are people that I know that have had great success using some of these other species in their pond. And it really just comes back to, you know, if you want to be keeping a really close eye on your pond and doing active management a lot throughout the year, then you can make some of these other species work. They're just a little, if you want to sort of more a set and forget sort of style, then some of these more traditional species might be better for you. With regards to invasive species, you know, there are some species that are invasive in our natural systems, like Asian carp, grass carp are invasive when they get out and into rivers and stuff like that. So definitely want to keep an eye out for those. But there are a lot of other species that are not necessarily invasive. They might be native to your area, but they can cause problems in your pond. So those bullhead catfish that I mentioned can be really bad if you get them in your pond, and it's very hard to get them out. Another problem species that seems to get into a lot of ponds are green sunfish. So they're related to bluegill, but they're more aggressive and they don't get as large typically. And so what happens is they tend to outcompete everything else, but they don't get large enough for you to really want to catch to eat. And so you end up with a pond full of these green sunfish that don't really help you out too much. And so there are definitely some species that can cause problems, and we have some of our publications definitely talk about these, and we can talk about more of these next week too.
Right. Jessica also highly encourages landowners to look at the surrounding area and all of the things that we put into on turf grass, and how that can actually run into the ponds and cause issues in the ponds, rather than using just fish maybe to handle a vegetation issue. Think about prevention rather than treatment.
Yeah,
Um,
I would definitely, reiterate that, prevention for a lot of these things can actually be much more effective than treatment. It can be less expensive, it can be more successful. And, the common scenario that I get quite a bit is whether it's an individual or a homeowners association, they want to have green lawns, but clear ponds. And if you want green lawns, you're going to end up with green ponds. And so it's important to think about your land use practices and some preventative things you can do if you're really interested in your pond management.
Great. Tim is asking, will catfish help reduce the leaf litter?
Catfish, they're omnivorous, so they'll eat plants and fish and also some dead and decaying things. They probably won't eat a lot of leaf litter. They'll eat some dead fish. They'll eat live fish too. They'll predate on live fish, and then they do eat some mussels, crayfish, and they'll probably eat some live plants. But they're probably not going to eat too many dead plants, and they're probably not going to eat too much leaf litter. So leaf litter is one of those things where if you've got a big leaf litter problem, and it's often the case if you've got a lot of trees around your pond, that might be something that you need to try and physically remove some of that with a backhoe or something every few years. There's not a lot that really helps out too much with leaf litter.
Gwen is asking if there's a fish hatchery close to Purdue. Her farm, which has a small pond, is in Benton County, and she was looking for maybe a place to take her grandson to have a look while they're visiting next week.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly of any real close to Purdue. I do know that the DNR keeps a list of fish hatcheries that you can check out. One of the hatchery that we use to get fish for our research and other things we do, we actually get from Southern Indiana. But I'll try and find that link to the DNR page that has those list of hatcheries, and you can see what one's closest to you or what one's close to Purdue, and you can maybe call them and check out what might work best for you.
Are those hatcheries typically open for a visit from the public?
I'm not sure, and it would just be a matter of calling them and seeing if they are. And I don't know, how things have changed with COVID and stuff either. But yeah, so it would just be a matter of calling them and asking. But I do know that sometimes too, it's worthwhile checking out your local stock and feed place as well, because sometimes what they do is that they'll do a bulk order from a fish hatchery. And so even if you're not close to one, you might talk to them, and if they have a dozen people interested in getting fingerlings, then they'll put in a bulk order that the truck will come with the fish, and then you can go just to your local feed and supply place to get those fish. So that's something to keep in mind too.
That's great. Are there any other questions that we have for Mitch? Well, Mitch, thank you again so much. Fascinating, great information. As he mentioned, we'll be back next week with fish stocking and harvest. And then the fourth and final episode or session in the series will be aquatic management, aquatic vegetation management. So with that, we'll go ahead and say goodbye to everybody. I will follow